After I graduated from college back in the 1980s, I spent large parts of the next 3 years living in this small tent, or sometimes working on boats. I was content to be largely free of stuff, though my parents and some friends worried. I did eventually settle indoors and satisfy a need to prove to myself that I could sustain conventional pursuits, like graduate school. Even so, those years deepened questions shaped by undergraduate courses in the humanities, questions about meaning. How much should we modern, or postmodern, if you prefer, humans consume? What is a good life? If a person can readily exceed survival needs, how much more is appropriate? How much more is forgivable? What should I give back, give away, give up, hold close? Moving through middle age, marriage, motherhood, home ownership, professional life as an anthropologist, these questions haunt me. Now, haunt is a strong word, but I'm incredulous, or you could also say dumbstruck with disbelief, at all I've accumulated, at what this means, at how rapidly life would collapse if everyone consumed like me, like a middle-class American. Because it could take 5 to 6 Earths or more for all humans to do that. But they don't. You see, I'm lucky. I've experienced other possibilities, not only during the tent days, but also more profoundly so while living in rural India. However, the impact of my way of living is endangering those other possibilities. What responsibility do middle class and elite consumers bear for this situation? Why isn't consumption a key issue on climate summit agendas? For people in the United States who are concerned about intersecting inequalities and climate change, it is typically the elephant in the room. Most would far rather talk of R&D, green technology, and carbon markets than of cavalier consumption and its status either as the measure of the good life or as a driver of climate change. So I'm not going to talk much more today, actually, about United States consumers or the appalling sweatshop practices that feed our habit, though both are worthy of extended reflection. Instead, I'm going to talk about how life is changing, for better and worse, in a corner of India, the Kumaon Himalayas, where ordinary residents don't have access either to cavalier consumption or to sweatshop employment. In this way, their lives are far more typical of those of much of humankind today, while their spectacular location makes visible an unsettling relationship between economic growth and climate change. In March of 1999, I returned to Lakshmi Ashram, a Gandhian school for rural Himalayan girls, where I'd visited in 91 and returned to carry out fieldwork from 93 to 95 to discuss a book project. You see, a number of amazing rural women change makers had studied at this school, which was established back in 1946, and I really wished to learn from their life stories and their social justice work. Today, Lakshmi Ashram is a residential school of about 70 staff and girls, most from families who cannot easily meet survival needs. Basic classrooms convert to bedrooms, and most residents own but a few changes of clothes. Teachers encourage their pupils to question the notion that a good life should emphasize lavish consumption and to embrace social justice work for their communities. My first days back at the school in '99 were surreal. Each evening, the ground trembled with a recent earthquake's aftershocks, and black hills glowed with jagged red lines of fire, really like menacing bloodshot eyes. And a restive leopard paced through the night just beyond the scope of human vision. Some Himalayan dry seasons bring these rampaging fires, some do not. It really just depends upon the rains. Things culminated one very hot afternoon when gusty winds conspired to lift a ground fire into a wall of flame that soared through pine tree tops, was poised to damage the school. Teachers and children darted into the fire's edge, trying to beat it back with tree branches, and water drums were emptied into the blaze. They failed. The fire roared up the slope, but just as it seemed about to touch the cow barn, water poured from the sky, and then it was out. Such soaking rain didn't fall elsewhere that day, and later on, no one believed our story. Not really. I recall sitting in the brief downpour with my friends, filthy and dumbstruck. "This is how it is now," a woman proclaimed. "This is God. Thank God." I left the hills that year with field notes that spoke to a sense of unease and accelerating change. 8 years later, in 2007, I sat on a veranda overlooking this small town, just below the school that had narrowly escaped the fires, chatting with a farmer whose family had housed me for over a year, more than a decade earlier. I wanted to know how political and economic changes had affected the women in her family. She smiled ruefully and declared, "There is no change in women's lives. As it was before, so it is now. Our work is exactly the same. The change is this: everything has become much more expensive because of the tourists. Now we have piped water, whereas before we did not, so this is good, but expensive. We have more electricity and a gas stove connection now, but these things are expensive. The main change is this: with all of these tourists, many, many more monkeys and mosquitoes have come. The monkeys eat up what I plant, the mosquitoes suck out my blood. This is the only benefit." Now, her comments contrasted sharply with those of a teacher at the Gandhian school, who emphasized new aspirations and new community organizations. "Of course there are changes, Rebecca. The biggest difference is this: girls want to do something. Before, girls only expected and wished to work in the house. Now they want to progress. Now they are able to progress. They should progress. Now there are women's organizations, schools." A couple of years later, back in Kumaun yet again in 2009, I gasped to the man driving me along a mountain road to stop. A leopard had just leapt up onto the roadside. Not this one. I didn't have a camera ready, but looking something like this one, perhaps. And not a yard from my elbow at the open window as we had slowed to take a hairpin turn. The driver stopped, and I pointed out the big cat, who strolled around behind the car and sat down with the careless aristocratic flourish that holds humans in thrall of genus Panthera. Unaccountably, and contrary to all each of us very well knew about best practices with big predators, we were unable to resist slowly emerging from the car. The big cat regarded us momentarily, tail perhaps twitching slightly, and then turned and sauntered off into the forest. Now, Himalayan leopards don't generally appear in broad daylight, and later on, no one believed our story. Not really. And our impulse to greet the leopard was met with incomprehension. Everyone in the hills knew that nocturnal leopard attacks on humans seemed more common in recent years. In 2014, yet again, a few years had passed since my previous trip to Kumaun. This time, my teenage son and I shared a room at the Gandhian school. The ground didn't tremble, but we were bitten up by clouds of mosquitoes and advised to keep our door bolted shut to avoid invasion by gray langurs and rhesus monkeys, who had acquired a confidence for burgling unheard of in the past. When I visited my friends in the village below the school, I was confronted by a thuggish monkey who scampered up, snatched my sack of bananas, scurried a mere few yards away, and sat down to eat the fruit, just relishing it. I was completely stunned, but my friend was not. She dashed to reclaim my bananas and exclaimed, "This is how it is now. Everything is different. We don't know when the rains will come or what to grow, and the monkeys take all." A trend to shift cultivated terraces from grains to fruits and vegetables had locked farmers into a pattern of pitched skirmishes with our ever more brazen primate cousins. Meanwhile, organizations in the village trained women to assume leadership roles reserved by gender in the local government. and floods tore through the mountains with the arrival of monsoon, washing away roads and villages, and killing and stranding people on an unprecedented scale. Some farming villages stood nearly abandoned, but some relatively privileged hill youth experienced what they considered to be a boon. A rather unusual for-profit company set up a business process outsourcing venture right in town. Select youth with university degrees no longer had to move to cities on the plains to seek employment in the lucrative global outsourcing sector. Not only fire and floods, but also new roads, schools, power lines, water pipes, and aspirations etched a shifting landscape of vexed interspecies encounters. So much had changed. Now, collectively, you could say that these stories speak to different types of incredulity, or you could also say, if you prefer, gobsmacking disbelief in the face of transformations taking place at the confluence of climate change and economic change in the Western Himalayas. The fifth assessment report released by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change presents data which points to serious consequences for humans and the environment across the globe. The top graph shows rising temperatures. The second shows rising sea levels. We see rising greenhouse gas concentrations in the third, and notable carbon dioxide emissions with some modest reduction of emissions right here due to the 2008 economic crisis when we consumed less. In fact, emissions data demonstrates that economic growth and the consumption that reflects and promotes it, that is, capitalism itself, has become an increasingly significant driver of emissions growth. Since the early 90s, India's participation in the global economy has steadily increased, with notable economic growth since the 2000s. Sectors of the urban population with a strong foothold in the new economy have experienced opportunity and growing prosperity, but recently, the World Health Organization found that Delhi has among the highest levels of air pollution on Earth. Growth-fostered climate change, produced through consumption by the world's elites and middle classes, also disproportionately affects vulnerable coastal and mountain regions, where communities just like the one I have described continue to depend upon climate-sensitive sectors, forests, farming, fisheries. Moreover, the reach of climate change into regions like the Himalayas brings the intensification of intersecting inequalities promoted by economic growth into sharp relief. Rising temperatures, more intense but less frequent rains, an uptick in extreme weather events like floods and wildfire, and crop raiding by monkeys and langurs are associated with climate change and make it harder to farm. The boosted discretionary incomes of global middle class and elite urbanites has increased tourism and vacation home construction in the region. These activities can disturb habitat and contribute to bringing wild animals, produce-loving primate cousins, but also wild boar, black bear, big cats, closer to human communities. Ready availability of subsidized grains grown in large agricultural zones on the plains enables farmers to sow fruits and vegetables as cash crops rather than food grains. But some farmers say that these crops are more vulnerable than grains to weather variability. So the shift to cash crops and market participation may actually render some communities less secure. Since women do most of the farming in the region, while men often migrate to cities on the plains to seek employment, these changes have a gender dimension. Climate change not only makes it hard to know when to plant what and when to harvest, but also brings more mosquitoes. So malaria and dengue fever creep higher into the mountains. Now these factors combine to create a tremendous push for education and migration preferably right out of the region, at least in the eyes of many ambitious youth, but especially out of farming as a primary occupation. With better access to electricity, education, electronic media, globalized images of affluent urban lifestyles shape youthful aspirations in the mountains as much as anywhere else. Along with their peers across the globe, they too desire firm footholds in compelling new spaces fostered by economic growth. They too yearn to do something, as the teacher quoted earlier voiced with regard to rural girls, and to experience increased consumption as one measure of their success. Yet, opportunities in the new economy are tightly limited, even as it kindles expansive desires. Fragile aspirations can become frustrated. The youth suicide rate is climbing in some areas. This confluence of climate change and economic growth points to a global reality, a reality that is made visible and compelling in the rural Himalayas. What the Himalayan situation shows us is that because economic growth is a major driver of climate change, it is not a straightforward solution to global poverty. And it reveals the arrogance of placing policy emphasis narrowly upon vulnerable communities, asking them to adapt to climate change. It is prosperous middle class and elite consumers, I'd say especially right here in the United States, who must adapt, given that our ordinary daily habits, right, yield one of the highest average per capita carbon production rates on Earth. Yes, of course, we must continue to adapt via innovations in clean energy, conscious consumerism, and even carbon markets. But we need to turn and greet the elephant in the room, cavalier consumption and its use to define a good life that is itself a major driver of climate change. So I want to go back to the Himalayas for one last quick story. Recently, members of a Hill Women's organization joined together with members of Lakshmi Ashram, the Gandhian school that I mentioned earlier, to seek information about a cement company's proposal to pay handsomely for their land. This land, exactly this land, and install a plant that would bring vital jobs to the area and economic growth. When women farmers, many of whom struggled to meet survival requirements, whose families really needed those jobs, learned that the local fields and watershed would be seriously polluted by the venture, they successfully blocked it and pushed for sustainable development plans. I'm told that the cement company representatives were incredulous. If you're prepared to be inspired by this and struggle with me, I want to leave you with 3 questions to think about. If you can readily exceed your survival needs, how much more is appropriate? How much more is forgivable? What will you give back, give up, give away? Find your own point of view and go big with your actions. Get involved in public policy and reimagine the good life, the good society. Make people incredulous. Thank you.